everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Porkins Great Game. I am Pierce Redmond, and joining me, as always, to discuss the geopolitics of Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the global war on terror is Boiling Frogs Post contributor and author of the new Great Game Roundup, Christoph Gehrman. Christoph, how are you?
Thanks, Pierce. I'm fine. Great to be here.
Excellent. And just a quick reminder, you can find this podcast and all the other podcasts by going to porkinspolicyreview.wordpress.com. And you can also find it on Christoph's site, which is, of course, christophgehrman.blogspot.com. Well, we've got quite a bit of stuff to cover on this episode. And so I guess we'll just jump right into it. And I think perhaps we'll start with something that happened literally after we, ended recording last month. There was quite a bit of new stuff, but the most new thing that happened just after that, of course, was the changing of the guard at NATO, and we no longer have Anders Fogh Rasmussen to point our rage at. Instead, we have a new person, and this is, of course, Jens Stoltenberg, who is a former Prime Minister of Norway. He was Prime Minister first in 2000 to 2001, and then later from 2005 to 2013. And this is important to focus on, obviously. Anytime we have somebody new coming into such a powerful position. And Jens Stoltenberg, for anyone who doesn't know, is a pretty big kind of globalist insider. He was the leader of the Labour Party in Norway from 2002 to 2014. He was also finance minister from 96 to 97, minister of industry and energy from 93 to 96, and was also the leader of the Workers' Youth League from 85 to 89. And Stoltenberg, again, like I said, has been around for a while. He was very instrumental in the 2008 financial crash. He's a big fan of Bill Gates and his vaccine program, climate change at the UN, things such as that. And he's also noted as being pretty hawkish in terms of defense spending and the defense of Norway. And he has been instrumental in increasing expenditures in terms of defense spending within all of the NATO countries. Norway is now one of the top defense spenders. But anyway, Christoph, who is Jens Stoltenberg? How will this be changing NATO? I know that when he was first appointed back in October 1st of this year, he was, there was this sort of idea that he would be more conciliatory or friendly towards Russia. But I'd like to see your take on this.
Yes, he's a very interesting character. As you mentioned, he was portrayed as some kind of dove when he was appointed in March. He's probably best known for his response to the terrorist attacks in 2011 in Norway, when right-wing extremist Anders Breivik killed 77 people and wounded more than 300. At the memorial service for the victims, Stoltenberg pledged to combat the atrocity with more democracy, more openness, and more humanity. And he shot to prominence on the international stage after this statement. That's not exactly the words you would expect from a man who went on to become Secretary General of NATO and replaced warmonger Rasmussen. But statements like this and his youth as an anti-war activist were picked up by the media to portray him as a more conciliatory Secretary General. His ties with Russia were also highlighted in this regard. During his time in office, Stoltenberg managed to negotiate a deal with Russia that ended a 4-decade dispute over the Arctic maritime borders of the two countries, and he built a personal friendship with then President Medvedev during the time. And after his appointment as Secretary General became public in March of this year, rumors about his KGB past began to surface in the press. The Norwegian intelligence officials commenting on these rumors even admitted that there had been some attempts by the KGB to recruit Stoltenberg in the early 1990s, but that the attempts had failed. And despite all the talk about Stoltenberg's close Russia ties and his mediating skills, one of his first actions as Secretary General was to declare that NATO could deploy its forces wherever it wants, and that NATO's plans to beef up its military presence in Eastern Europe with this new rapid reaction force don't violate the 1997 NATO Russia Founding Act, which prohibits NATO from basing large number of troops in Eastern Europe. Some NATO members, in particular the UK, Poland, and the Baltic states, have recently been pushing to abolish the NATO Russia Founding Act altogether, and Germany and a few other countries are opposing this vehemently. Russia wasn't happy about Stoltenberg's first statements as Secretary General, yes, and said that these comments caused no optimism. But the Russians knew, of course, what they had to expect. Just because a new Secretary General arrives, NATO won't change its policies. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that Secretary General is just the public face of NATO.
Yes.
He's the one traveling around the globe and representing the military alliance in the media. And therefore, he's always, the Secretary General is always a European, to create a false impression that NATO is a European organization led by Europeans. Recently, we had, for example, Jaap de Hoogschäfer from the Netherlands, followed by Rasmussen from Denmark, and now Stoltenberg from Norway. But although the Secretary General gets most of the attention, the person really in charge of NATO is the Supreme Allied Commander, the SACEUR. And this post is always filled by an American to ensure that NATO serves its true purpose, which is, as the first Secretary General of NATO once famously said, to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And the current SACEUR of NATO is, of course, Philip Breedlove. He and Rasmussen made a perfect team, both very good warmongers, and Breedlove showed during the Ukraine crisis time and time again that he is trying to create a confrontation with Russia. He has been hyping the Russian threat and talking about an imminent Russian invasion. And it's going to be interesting to see if Stoltenberg picks up where Rasmussen left off and follows in his footsteps and joins Breedlove, or if he actually tries to mediate. But I don't think we can expect anything like that from him.
Yeah, no, I would not hold your breath on that. This seems simply like a cosmetic change to reintroduce somebody that's not quite as abrasive as Rasmussen was, who certainly was very hawkish and very, very, like you said, a big warmonger. And before we completely leave this, I think it's interesting with some of these appointments by NATO. And like you said, obviously, the real power lies with the Supreme Allied Commander, who is, of course, American. And the real power within NATO, to some degree, is the American power. And it's interesting that Rasmussen was such a big cheerleader for George W. Bush's invasion of Afghanistan and his sort of global war on terror. And it was seen by many that Rasmussen's appointment was sort of a thank you for all of his work. And of course, the terrorist attack that Breivik was involved in on Utoya Island he was attacking the youth league of the party that Jens Stoltenberg is a member of. And of course, I think there is a much larger story behind what actually transpired in July in 2011. And of course, as you said, Stoltenberg played an integral part in that, at least in the sort of media representation of what was going on. So it's interesting, and perhaps this was a sort of thank you for all of that. But yeah, as you said, I don't really think we're going to see much of a change. NATO seems pretty locked into some sort of confrontation with Russia, and of course, Stoltenberg is just a figurehead. But there was also some other big news, and something which I think we should really be paying much more attention to. And this was something that happened, just a few days after Stoltenberg was appointed the new head of NATO. And that was on October 5th, when a suicide bomber in Grozny, which is the capital of Chechnya in Russia, a suicide bomber exploded a vest and killed 5 police officers at the Grozny Day celebrations, which also coincided this year with the leader of Chechnya, Kadyrov's birthday. Now, as I said, this is pretty shocking because Chechnya, for better or worse, has had a very relative calm security situation going on there, especially within recent years. And while other areas near it, such as Dagestan and some of the other small little areas, have seen a spike in violence, Grozny and Chechnya have not really. So this was a pretty big deal. Now, the suspect allegedly is a man called Opti Mudorov, who's 19 years old, who, according to Russian news services, disappeared about 2 months ago, and then went on to implement this bombing. And I read an interesting article in Radio Free Europe, which was called "Who Was Behind the Grozny Suicide Bombing?" And we'll of course link up to this. And in this, they sort of made mention of the fact that the new leader of the sort of Chechen militant movement, I believe his name is Kebakov, has come out against suicide bombings, which is not really exactly. If you read what he actually said, that's not really true. He said that they can be negative in terms of tactics, not in terms of morality, because you're losing a fighter. But the Radio Free Europe article had a very interesting takeaway at the end, where they said that there are two possibilities for what transpired in Grozny. The first being that this was a lone wolf, which we love. Every terrorist seems to be just a lone wolf. But of course, then they pose the question, where did he get the bombs? And interesting. But the second possibility, which might be a wink and a nod to the type of people that read Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, was that he was the, quote, unwitting victim of a false flag recruitment by somebody out to spoil Kadyrov's birthday. Now, very interesting. First off, using the term false flag, and of course they're not saying who would have done this. And in the days sort of following this, there was a lot of kind of conjecture over who this person was, who was helping him. There is another individual who was later shot. I know that there was some reports that Jamwa, which is the Josh al-Mujarin wal Ansar, which is a Chechen terrorist group which operates in Syria, had taken credit for this. But Christoph, maybe you can kind of break down what happened in Grozny and perhaps contextualize it, because it is a very, I spent like an hour and a half just going through all of these different articles. And, at the end of the day, I mean, you can't really make heads or tails over what's going on. So, what is your take on the Grozny bombing, and how should we really be viewing this in terms of the conflict going on in the Caucasus?
Yes, as you mentioned, it's a very important event, and it sends a very strong message to the Chechen and the Russian authorities, because the date and the place of the attack are very significant. On October 5th, police who were manning metal detectors at the entrance hall of the local concert hall in Grozny noticed a suspicious young man, and when they attempted to search him, the man detonated an explosive device, killing himself and 5 policemen and wounding 12 others. Given that the incident happened ahead of a concert dedicated to Grozny Day, the police most likely prevented a far more devastating attack. And since the attack took place not only on Kadyrov's birthday and Grozny Day, but also on Eid al-Adha, the Feast of the Sacrifice, which is one of the most important celebrations in the Muslim calendar, I think that the date was not coincidental. And that it took place in Grozny is, of course, also a strong message, because, as you mentioned, most people still think of brutal war and jihadist gangs and terrorist attacks when they hear the word Chechnya. But this isn't the case anymore. By 2000, the republic was completely in ruins. Many Chechens had been killed and Grozny was completely destroyed. Even plans to abandon the city and build a new capital elsewhere were made at the time. But now, 14 years later, both the Chechen capital and the Chechen Republic are almost unrecognizable. Traditional Islam has completely replaced Wahhabism, and the warlords and Chechen terrorists have been eliminated one by one. The Chechens are now increasingly seen as tough and reliable allies of Russia, and it can be argued that Chechnya is the single most important factor of stability in the entire Caucasus region, while the insurgency has moved on to neighboring Dagestan. Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen Republic, blamed the North Caucasus insurgency for the attack. And as you mentioned, Radio Free Europe has tried to suggest that the leader of the group of the Caucasus Emirate, the leading group of the North Caucasus insurgency, had nothing to do with the attack. And it's still not entirely clear who perpetrated it. The only group which allegedly claimed responsibility was Jamba, the Syria-based group of Chechen mercenaries. But this was later denied, and the only connection to the 19-year-old Mudarov, who perpetrated the attack, was another insurgent who was later killed. Interestingly enough, Kadyrov, who usually boasts about any such things, for example, Syria connections to terror attacks in Chechnya, or when some important terrorists are killed, has mentioned neither of those things. And it's very interesting that Jamba came up in regard to the attack, because it's, of course, it was led by our friend Tarkan Batirashvili until he joined ISIS. And Batirashvili and Kadyrov have their own little personal battle going on. Bloomberg reported, for example, a few weeks ago that Batirashvili had called his father in Georgia after ISIS had taken Mosul, and he told his father that Russia would be next. He reportedly said, "I have many thousands following me now, and I'll get more. We will have our revenge against Russia." He's apparently driven by an intense hatred of Russia, which reminds me somewhat of Greg McPherson, the Gladio B operative in Spielberg's new novel, The Lone Gladio.
Yes.
Perhaps that's not the only parallel between those two characters. As I mentioned earlier, Moscow can now count on a reliable ally in the North Caucasus to deal with ISIS. And when ISIS released a video threatening to liberate Chechnya and the whole Caucasus, Chechen President Kadyrov responded by posting a photo of himself in a Putin t-shirt to Instagram with a lengthy caption calling the fighters' words a childish threat and accusing the Islamic State of being bandits trained and armed by the United States and the West to destroy strong and resource-rich Islamic countries. And this prompted ISIS commander Batirashvili to put a $5 million bounty on Kadyrov's head. And last week, the battle entered the next round, and Kadyrov claimed that he was trying to hunt down the leader of ISIS, of the ISIS bandits, as he called them, saying, "My people are looking for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, but he's nowhere to be found." And Kadyrov also offered an explanation for that, the support of Western intelligence agencies. And he urged al-Baghdadi to take off his mask and admit that he's a CIA agent. And much to the dismay of the CIA and ISIS, most Chechens actually share Kadyrov's opinion. A recent survey of Chechens by the Caucasus-based news outlet Caucasian Not found that most respondents believe that ISIS fighters and other so-called Syrian rebels are just fighting for Western interests, and they are opposed to the ongoing conflict in Syria.
And I know, and when I was looking at this story, I mean, instantly you're trying to figure out, who could possibly be behind this. And of course, the first sort of, knee-jerk reaction is, well, this must be NATO and this type of Gladio operations that we see all over. But then, of course, certain things don't really add up. Again, like you said, where could these people have gotten the materials to do this? Everybody is dead. Of course, there's no one to question anymore. And then, like you mentioned, Kadyrov is quite quiet about this, which is sort of, strange. At the same time, though, it seems like, outlets like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, other people, I was reading an article in the Caucasus Knot where they quoted two people, one of whom is works at the Russian Academy of Sciences, and the other is a board member of the Moscow Carnegie Center. So, take that with a grain of salt. But both of them are skeptical of Jamwa's involvement in any of this. And of course, now we're seeing police raids all over the region, in Durban and Dagestan and elsewhere. So, if this is just some sort of lone wolf attack, what does that mean for the region? But could this be the sort of beginning of a new type of insurgency movement there, or are we kind of just seeing a blip on the radar? Because it does seem to be happening at a time when you can't turn on the news or go to a website without hearing about ISIS this, ISIS that. The Islamic State is going to come and implement Sharia law everywhere. So what is it? Is this just sort of the beginning of something, or is this just kind of another hype tactic?
Yes, you're of course right to point out that the Russian authorities and Kadyrov have been using the ISIS hype to implement harsher anti-terror measures, for example. But we also have to take into account that there has been a lot of military and political activity in the South Caucasus in recent months. For example, Georgia's alleged offer to host a training camp for Syrian rebels, and this caused a great stir in Russia. And some analysts are now saying that a second Russian front is being created in the South Caucasus. And as Sibel Edmonds has pointed out during her recent interviews, we are probably going to see more operations and activities in this area in the not too distant future, with Abkazia now again also hitting the headlines.
Well, and maybe with that we can move to Abkazia. That was another topic that we were going to discuss today, and in my opinion, that this seems to be kind of the actual kind of ramping up of tensions in the Caucasus right now. I mean, the Grozny bombing is one thing, but what's going on in Abkhazia right now? We have a new treaty between Russia and this breakaway region. And for anyone that doesn't know, Abkazia is a small strip of what was once Georgian territory in the northwest. They fought a very brutal, nasty war in the early 1990s with, just slaughter on both sides, claims of ethnic cleansing going on. But essentially, the Abkhaz people, with the tacit support of Russia, expelled the Georgian people and essentially created a de facto state within this former region within Georgia. Now, since the 90s, Abkhazia has been backed by Russia, both militarily and economically, and they just recently signed this new treaty. And essentially the treaty is just sort of more of the same old stuff. They're talking about integrating the region more into Russia. There will be more sort of regulations in terms of tax and customs, getting them closer to the Eurasian Customs Union, which is a grouping of several sort of former Soviet satellite states. But there was such a hubbub about this when the story first broke about the sort of the actual text of this draft. So, Christoph, what is actually in this treaty, and is it really all that different from what we've already seen vis-a-vis the relationship between Abkhazia and Russia?
Yes, the treaty is very significant, and they haven't signed it yet. They are still talking about it, and I would have to go back a few months and mention first that this summer there was a small revolution in Abkhazia where one pro-Russian leader replaced another one, and the new Abkhaz president, Raul Krachimba is his name. He's a former KGB agent and also a sharp opponent of unification with Georgia. Georgia hopes to regain control over its lost territories eventually, but the people in Abkhazia and also in South Ossetia oppose this vehemently. And a few weeks ago, Krachimba stated that he wants to eliminate all crossing points but one into Georgian-controlled territory. Currently, there are about 5 crossing points, but Krachimba said that there should be only one for reasons of national security. And predictably, this was criticized by the Georgian government, which is afraid of losing the breakaway region once and for all. And shortly thereafter, Russia offered this treaty that you mentioned, which proposes a merger of military forces, coordination of police, and an alignment with the Eurasian Economic Union. And despite already being heavily dependent on Russia, Abkhazia is actually serious about its claim to independence. And some people are now concerned that signing the treaty would lead to loss of sovereignty. The cornerstone of the treaty is the formation of a collective military force, which is supposed to repel any attempt by Georgia to retake the territory. And many Abkhazs believe that the Ukraine crisis has increased the likelihood of such an attack, but they don't want to curtail the powers of their own army, which many Abkhazs regard as one of the pillars of national identity. And given that there are also objections to several other points in the draft treaty, it's unlikely that Abkhazia will sign the proposed treaty as it's currently now being discussed. It's still a matter of debate, but even Abkhaz leader Karimba, who had already called for the signing of exactly such a treaty before he came to power in summer of this year, has admitted that he too disagrees with some articles of the draft treaty. Georgia didn't really notice the differences between Russia and Abkhazia and is completely freaking out over the treaty and has condemned this as an attempt to annex occupied Abkhazia. And at the same time, of course, not mentioning the NATO military build-up in Georgia. It's pretty funny.
And I think that that's a great sort of way to introduce that whole idea, because, like you said, the response from Georgia was just very angry. The defense minister was quoted as saying very aggressive foreign policy steps were going to have to be taken. Both the presidents and prime ministers of Georgia have been just completely livid about all of this, while all the time ignoring the fact that Georgia, for all intents and purposes, is no longer a sovereign nation when you think about how much NATO controls everything related to Georgia. And of course, Philip Breedlove, who we mentioned earlier in the podcast, recently spoke in Tbilisi and talked about how Georgia was going to, be more integrated within NATO for future warfare. Who knows what that means? And as you said again, Georgia will be hosting a new NATO training base. We spoke last month on the idea that Georgia might even be training these Syrian rebels. And all along, every time that this happens, Russia has been very upfront about, that the more Georgia becomes integrated with NATO, the more issues we're going to see in that region, in South Ossetia, in North Ossetia, that type of border. So of course, I find it kind of ridiculous because, again, for all intents and purposes, Abkhazia would not exist without Russian backing. If Russia left, Georgia could probably march in. And, on the same token, Georgia talking about this as being occupied territory is a little silly. Because they have no power over anything that goes there. The government in exile, as they call them, just sits in Tbilisi. They have no power over what goes on in Abkhazia. But I know that you wrote recently in the new Great Game that we were really seeing the situation in the Caucasus heating up. And, how should we be interpreting what's going on in Abkhazia, say, in the near future? How is this going to change the situation there?
That's difficult to say. I don't think Abkhazia and Russia will sign this treaty anytime soon. And so there is really no reason for Georgia to be freaking out and to make a fuss about it. But they will probably use this as a pretext to push their integration with NATO and to conduct a more aggressive foreign policy. As you mentioned, Defense Minister Alazania has already threatened Russia to do this, which makes you wonder how Alazania would describe Georgia's foreign policy so far.
Yes.
But I think that the United States and its allies are planning to up the pressure on Russia in the Caucasus region, and that Abkhazia could be a point where they're trying to stage some kind of provocation.
Yeah, and I think that's how we should be viewing what's going on both in Abkhazia and also perhaps even what's going on in Grozny. That we're starting to see the build up to something. And you were mentioning before, and Sibel has said this several times, but that yes, that region, particularly Georgia and also Dagestan, we've got the Boston bombing connection there. We're going to see that resurface again, and I think it's very important to pick up on these issues, because it's very easy for them to kind of disappear. And of course, you mentioned the Caucasus and all of these little tiny regions within Russia, and it's very difficult. But again, we need to keep looking at this. So I think maybe now we can move on to two extremely important and mysterious vehicular deaths, which took place days apart from one another. I believe actually it was just one day. Now, one of these received wall-to-wall coverage, while the other, was just a little, tiny blurb in the Western media. And I am, of course, talking about the deaths of the CEO of French oil giant Total, Christophe de Margerie, and the death of Press TV journalist Serena Shim. Now, we wanted to talk about these because in many ways they are intimately related to what is going on both in the Caucasus and Central Asia, as well as the sort of greater conflict that we're seeing going on in Syria right now, which of course again is intimately related with the type of Gladio network that is operating in the region that you write about, Christoph. But let's take a look first at Christophe de Margerie, and let's talk a little bit about why this is important and how this relates to what we're talking about. And of course, anyone who doesn't know, de Margerie, as I said, was the CEO of Total, which is one of the six what they call super major oil companies. The others being BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Dutch Royal Shell, and ConocoPhillips. So you can see how big this company is. He was extremely close with Russia. Lots of investment and business there. And I guess I should mention this, I haven't already, but he died on October 20th when his plane flew into a snowplow, or the snowplow crashed into the plane. There is a little bit of conjecture about what actually went on there. But anyway, de Margerie and three other passengers on the plane all died. And the man driving the plow lived. And as I was saying before, de Margerie was very close with Russia. Putin remarked on his death that they had lost a true friend of our country. And de Margerie was also very big, outspoken opponent of sanctions against Russia. So, well, Christoph, what's your take on this? Because I know that a lot of people in the alt media sort of jumped on this as, he was assassinated, or that there was foul play involved. And I am very willing to go down that route. And indeed, there are some strange circumstances surrounding who was in the air traffic control unit, who was this snowplow operator. But how should we view the death of Christophe de Margerie in the sort of larger picture of the new Great Game?
Yes, the accident was very weird. As you mentioned, the snowplow, the plane hitting the snowplow, and the driver has been blamed for the incident. He was reportedly drunk. His name is Vladimir Martinenko. He was detained, and his lawyer dismissed accusations that his client had been drunk as groundless. But according to a Moscow court, Martinenko had a blood alcohol content of 0.06%. And Interfax news agency reported that he had admitted drinking coffee with a liquor. He's now being kept in custody, and some airport employees who are accused of criminal negligence were also detained. A few top airport officials have resigned, and it's safe to say that more heads will roll for this. Apparently, the runway had been clear when the Total plane was given clearance to take off. But after the plane started moving, the crew noticed an object identified by them as a car crossing the road, and shortly thereafter they collided with the snowplow. Interestingly enough, the incident will be investigated by Mikhail Gurevich, the same man who led a probe into the 2010 plane crash of top Polish officials, including President Lech Kaczynski in Russia. For more information on this crash, I would refer people to James Corr Corbett's Crashes of Convenience episode. And is also a very interesting accident. But in contrast to Kaczynski's plane crash, which was convenient for many different players for different reasons, the plane crash of de Margerie was only convenient for Russia's adversaries. As you mentioned, he was one of Russia's most important allies in the West. And just hours before the deadly crash, he was said to have met with Medvedev to discuss new investments in Russia. In a speech shortly before he boarded the plane, he once again stressed that the sanctions against Russia were unfair and unproductive, and that he opposed efforts to render Russia isolated from the major global economic and political process. Of course, economic interests played a major role in this regard. Under his leadership, Total expanded its activities in Russia and teamed up with Russian companies such as the country's second largest gas producer, Novatek. In 2013, Russia became Total's biggest source of production, aside from Nigeria, the United Arab Emirates, and Norway. Lately, de Margerie was doing everything to keep his signature Russian project on track, the 27 billion Jamal LNG project, which is supposed to export liquefied natural gas to China. Jamal is developed by Novatek, China's CNPC, and Total. The project was therefore targeted by the sanctions, and US sanctions barred the project from receiving loans in dollars, which prompted de Margerie to say that Total and its partners would turn to Chinese banks. Especially de Margerie's comments regarding the role of the dollar in oil purchases have attracted a lot of attention in the aftermath of his death. As many people on Twitter pointed out, Bloomberg published an article in July with the title Total's de Margerie sees no need for dollars in oil purchases. Thereby, de Margerie committed the mortal sin by arguing that there's no real reason for oil purchases to be made in dollars. He was quoted as saying, "Nothing prevents anyone from paying for oil in euros."
Yes.
But he made a statement, of course, in response to the $9 billion fine for the French bank BNP Paribas, which caused a great stir in France at the time. The fine was seen as an attempt to pressure the French government to cancel the Mistral deal with Russia, and Putin accused the US even of seeking to blackmail France. At the time, France's political and business establishment hit out against the hegemony of the dollar in international transactions, and the French finance minister even called for a rebalancing of the currencies. And I think de Margerie's comments have to be seen in this context.
Yes.
And not necessarily as a way of saying that they are going to abandon the dollar. But regardless of whether he was serious about dropping the dollar or not, I think he was a thorn in Washington's side. And a plane crash was definitely convenient for the United States, but it remains to be seen if there was some foul play involved. And so far, I haven't seen any evidence for this.
Yeah, and I think that's something important, because I know a lot of people will jump on stories like this and nitpick every little detail. I will say I found interesting that you mentioned the snowplow driver Martinenko. His lawyers are now claiming that pro-Kremlin media have stonewalled them for press conferences, and they no one will show up to report on what they have to say, and they have been saying that Martinenko was not drunk, that he was forced to sign a confession, and it seems like this might actually be nothing more than just complete negligence on the on behalf of the Russian airline administration. Supposedly it was a 24-year-old trainee who this was like one of her first days really on the job in the air traffic control unit, and she was the one who was overseeing de Margerie's plane taking off. So yeah, I mean, perhaps not everything is necessarily orchestrated. Of course, though, as you were right to point out, de Margerie really was a thorn in the side of the West, and what was seen as a big friend of Russia, and was very against these sanctions. He was quoted as saying, "Can we live without Russian gas? Not at all." But there was as I said at the beginning of this segment, there was another death, and I think that this one is perhaps a bit more important and is a bit more clear-cut as to this not being an accident. And as I said, this is Serena Shim, who is a Lebanese-American U.S. citizen who worked for Press TV, and she was killed in a very, very mysterious car crash. And this came after, she has been in Turkey and reporting on the conflict within Syria for a little while now. And she has done a lot of reporting talking about Turkish intelligence and their involvement in what is going on in the conflict in Syria. And she was just recently in the town of Surak in Turkey, which is just north of Kobani, where, of course, every day you can hear more and more about ISIS. Now, Shim was on Press TV just, I think, about a day or two before this car crash that killed her, where she was reporting on two very important facts. One, that ISIS was using NGO trucks, including World Food Organization trucks, to actually enter into Syria. And she allegedly even had some sort of photographic or video evidence of this. The other thing, important note here, is that she said that Turkish intelligence, the MIT, was looking for her and that they had accused her of being a spy. Now, for who, they never make mention of. But nonetheless, she said that she was, nervous and scared about this. She pointed out the correct fact that Turkey is perhaps one of the most dangerous places on the planet for journalists to be operating in. And as I said, just a few days after this, she was driving back to her hotel with her camerawoman, Judy Irish, when they collided with a cement mixer. Now, Shim was killed instantly. Irish was taken to a hospital, and the driver, whose Sukru Salan, was either detained briefly or left the scene entirely. There are conflicting reports about that, and perhaps we'll get into those. This is a really huge story, and I was actually kind of disappointed that more people weren't really focusing on this. Obviously, the mainstream media is not going to pick up on a story where a journalist from an Iranian news broadcaster is talking about the connections between Turkey and ISIS militants. But I was surprised that more people weren't really picking up on this story. And, Christoph, maybe you can kind of take it from there and we can explore first the actual death and what happened with this individual who supposedly was driving the cement mixer. And then let's move on to what Shim was actually saying.
Yes, very, very suspicious death. Serena Shim had already done a few very good investigative reports highlighting Turkey's role in supporting the so-called Syrian rebels. And I think she only returned recently to Turkey, which she mentioned in her last broadcast, if I remember correctly, and that the Turkish authorities, that she thought that the Turkish authorities are now getting worried because of her recent work, and they didn't know what they had to expect this time, because she had already done such good investigative work, and they had, of course, a very good reason to be worried. As you mentioned, she had reportedly received images of insurgents being smuggled across the border into Syria in World Food Organization and other NGO drugs. And Vijay Prashad wrote a very good piece on the death of Serena Shim, where he pointed out that Bazan Iso, a Syrian Kurdish journalist, had already reported that Qatari charities have been using the Jarabalus crossing to get aid to the Islamic State, but that nobody has mentioned so far that trucks with logos from international organizations are being used for this purpose as well. And Prashad likened Serena Shim's death to the murder of his friend and Asia Times colleague Salim Shahzad, who had uncovered collusion between Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Navy. And there are a few interesting parallels between Turkey and Pakistan. And Prashad also cited one Kurdish commander as saying the Islamic State is to Turkey as the Taliban is to Pakistan.
Yes.
And I think that's a very apt comparison. The Turkish city of Gaziantep is increasingly resembling Peshawar in the 1980s during Operation Cyclone. And some journalists have been warning of Turkey's Pakistanization. Without Turkey's strong support, ISIS and other terrorist groups in the region wouldn't last very long. And Turkish NGOs play a central role in this regard, and it's important to highlight this role. And if Serena Shim had really evidence of NGO trucks and World Food Organization trucks, I think she was meaning the World Food Program when she mentioned it. There's of course a very strong motive to get rid of her. We have, for example, seen the role of the humanitarian relief organization exposed in supporting the so-called Syrian rebels. Already last year, the Iranians reported that the humanitarian relief organization, IHH, has recruited and transferred hundreds of Albanians to Syria. And at the beginning of this year, the foundation was again being exposed by the Gülen movement, interestingly enough.
Yes.
With the power struggle between Erdogan and Gülen escalating, Gülen's men and the police stopped trucks carrying weapons on their way to Syria. Officially, the trucks were carrying aid to Turkmens in Syria, and initial reports said that it had been hired by the Humanitarian Relief Foundation. The Gülen movement used its influence in the police and media to expose that the trucks were actually carrying all kinds of weapons to the Syrian rebels as part of an operation by Turkish intelligence. And Turkish intelligence has been using NGOs such as the Humanitarian Relief Organization or Imkanda for various terror operations for years. Imkanda, for example, has supported the Chechen terrorists, and the Humanitarian Relief Foundation is now heavily involved in Syria. It's reportedly the biggest Turkish provider of aid to Syria, and I wouldn't be surprised if the trucks that Serena Shim mentioned, that some of the trucks that Serena Shim mentioned actually belong to this organization.
Yeah, and you had a really great article on Boiling Frogs Post called Turkish Power Struggle Impedes NATO Campaign in Syria, where you highlighted several of these instances where the IHH was involved in all sorts of bizarre things. And you just mentioned Imkander, which is another Turkish charity, and they, surprisingly enough, sort of relate back to our original what we were talking about before in the Caucasus. And after Doku Umarov, who was the emir of the Islamic Caucasus, died supposedly of wounds he received during fighting, there were multiple rallies with hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people in Turkey, of all places, organized by Imkander, praising the deceased emir. And Imkander also celebrated in September of 2013 defeat of a Russian initiative to ban the group within Russia. So again, really interesting. And I'd just like to point out that this talk about NGOs operating in Syria from Turkey, this is not new. I know that when this sort of Serena Shim story broke, a lot of people were, talking, oh my God. But again, Shim had been reporting this even a couple months back. But at the very beginning of the this conflict in Syria, people might have forgotten this, but there were multiple reports about different aid groups and foundations that were, leaving from Turkey and going into Syria. And in fact, I believe even IHH was, accused of some sort of mass slaughter of Syrian civilians, that they were somehow, helping to orchestrate all of this. So again, these things kind of go into the memory hole and then we forget about them. And just for, a little bit more sort of evidence on this, just, around the same time that Shim was probably murdered, there was an article in the Daily Beast from a reporter called Jamie Detner, who was in Gaziantep, which is just west of the city of Surak, where Shim was killed. And he was reporting that ISIS was controlling all of the humanitarian aid that was going into Syria. And he even quoted a bunch of aid workers as saying that ISIS makes them appoint members, sort of liaisons to these different NGOs. And there was also a video showing, airdropped weapons that were meant for Kurds falling into the hands of ISIS. This is not something that is particularly new. But this death is, as you say, very mysterious. And I actually found it interesting, not that they're necessarily related, but we also have the scissor look scandal, which involved aspects of the Turkish deep state coming out, and that also involved a mysterious car crash, where were they dead? Were they not dead? Who knows? So all very interesting. But I don't know. I mean, Christoph, do you have anything else to say on this? Because I do think it's a really important story. And IHH, as you've mentioned previously, is very instrumental in the deep state within Turkey.
Yes, as you mentioned, IHH was implicated in a massacre on Syrian civilians, I think, in January 2014. And the organization is, of course, also the owner of the Mavi Marmara, which became famous for this very interesting incident, which is also a huge topic, not exactly how it's being portrayed in the media. Yes, but the role of Turkish NGOs used by Turkish intelligence is very important, and I think that's one thing to keep an eye on. And the report that you mentioned by the Daily Beast was also very interesting about US aid supporting ISIS. What a surprise. And actually bribing ISIS to take the aid. And yes, for all the talk about ISIS being self-financed and independent of any state support, they are actually getting a lot of aid from the United States and its allies, and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, of course.
And just to kind of briefly wrap up the Serena Shim story, there is, as I said, some conjecture about what actually happened at the actual car crash incident. Now, Press TV, of course, is reporting that the alleged driver, Mr. Salan, of the cement mixer, is just disappeared. Now, Turkey is reporting that he was briefly detained and then was released. And this is all coming from this is all coming from the Hurriyet Daily, which is a daily newspaper, I believe is the largest within Turkey. And they're the only news source reporting on any of this. Now, as I said, they said that he was briefly detained and then was released, and they released a crash report saying that Irish, who was the camerawoman and driver of the car, is the sole culprit, and that she entered a junction too fast. She was violating traffic rules by turning right in the wrong lane, blah, blah, blah. So, of course, they're trying to wrap this story up very quickly. And I would just like to note that no one, when they're looking at this, of course, they look and say, oh, man, she was a spy. They never allege who she was spying for. I guess they're assuming perhaps the Iranians or whatnot. But no one is trying to counter what she was actually saying. So of course Turkish intelligence is saying, oh, well, she's a spy. Well, let's even suppose that she was, which I don't believe she was at all. If she was a spy, what about ISIS entering with NGO trucks? So I mean, they're not whatever, but she was a spy. So very interesting. And again, I think this story ties in with so many different angles in this sort of global war on terror, which stretches from Syria to Afghanistan right now and everywhere in between. So yeah, something really to kind of focus on and pick up on. And I guess we're kind of reaching the end of this conversation, but I think we have time for one little thing. And last podcast, we kind of mentioned something that was tangentially related to all of this, and we've got another little one, and this one is sort of funny in a way, perhaps. But Graham Fuller, who I hope everybody is somewhat familiar with, he is a top Gladio B operative. He is the man sort of who helped get Fethullah Gulen to come to the United States and, I guess in many ways sort of recruited him within the company, the agency. He lately seems to have been attempting to alter his public image. Now, I think this is in part to his very close connection to the Boston bombers. He is the father-in-law of Uncle Ruslan, who I hope people will be familiar with. And I'll provide some links, and including the first episode I did of Porkins Policy Radio, which dealt exclusively with Boston bombing, and we did quite a bit on Graham Fuller. But anyway, Graham Fuller has been writing a couple interesting articles, including one in the Huffington Post, of all places, which is entitled "Embracing Assad is a Better Strategy for U.S. Than Supporting the Least Bad Jihadis." And we're not going to spend too much time on this, but it is really interesting that this noted CIA agent, close friend of Fethullah Gulen, and is alleged to have been one of the sort of masterminds behind using radical Islam, is now saying that we need to support Assad and that he is better. And Christoph, I'd just like to get your quick take on this.
Yes, if some other former CIA official had made this statement, I wouldn't have wasted much thought on it. But considering that it's coming from the man who was instrumental in disseminating the idea of manipulating Muslims to use them as jihadi mercenaries against enemies of the United States, it's very, very interesting. And as you mentioned, Graham Fuller is one of the main CIA handlers of Fethullah Gulen, besides Morton Abramowitz. And he was targeted by the FBI Gladio B counterintelligence investigation, which has earned him a place in Sibel's State Secrets British Gallery. So it's really noteworthy that he's coming out with this statement at a time. It's at this point, nobody can deny that the strategy is failing in Syria. But the CIA knew this, of course, from the beginning, as the New York Times recently reported. And the Syrian rebels, the so-called Syrian rebels, won't be able to topple us unless NATO clears the way for them with tons of bombs, as they did in Libya. But since this isn't an option right now, I think Washington is going with Plan B, which is to prolong the conflict in order to balkanize Syria and move step by step towards the implementation of the Yinon plan. And so I'm wondering why Graham Fuller is now arguing that the US should permit or even assist Assad in ending the war, which makes absolutely no sense from Washington's point of view. What's your take on this?
Well, I mean, I guess I just see this as he needs to, at this point now, address the public because, I will freely admit I knew very little, if anything, about Graham Fuller. I had heard his name once before, I believe, in an interview that Sibel Edmonds gave. But it wasn't really until the Boston bombing when I started to hear about this guy and his connections with the family, with the Tsarnaev family. And I just sort of read, when I saw that he had wrote an article, I was kind of, my jaw dropped initially. Because this guy has been very, very quiet about everything related to his life and related to his connections with international terrorism and people like Fethullah Gulen. So I think that right now Graham Fuller just doesn't want to have this sort of notoriety, and I think he's probably Googled his own name and seen quite a few pieces in the alternative media pointing out who this character really is and what he does in his spare time. So this is really...
He actually started his own blog. He has his own website and he started to write his own blog. Yeah, nothing interesting, but he's of course trying to portray himself as some kind of completely innocent former CIA official.
Yes. Oh yeah, and there was even I think this was in the Fars news agency in Iran recently. They quoted Fuller as praising a new book by Gareth Porter, which goes into how the United States, manipulated evidence and whatnot to punish the Iranians, and that there is no nuclear program. So again, for somebody who, as you pointed out, was instrumental in radicalizing Muslims around the world into becoming terrorists, this is very interesting and something that we should, keep looking at because, these characters like Fuller are probably still intimately involved in Gladio B and the deep state. Even if, once you're in the CIA, you're always in the CIA. But anyway, I think we're going to leave it there for now. And of course, there is so much else going on in the region. We've got all sorts of things going on in Kyrgyzstan with NGO crackdowns. militants fighting in Syria, Al-Qaeda declaring war on China, and lots of stuff going on in Tajikistan between, and their border region with Afghanistan. So, of course, if you want to explore some more of these topics, then I would really suggest that you go and check out Christoph's work. And, of course, the New Great Game Roundup is published every week on boilingfrogspost.com. And you can also find his website on christophgerman.blogspot.com. So, Christoph, is there anything else you want to point to us we should be looking out for in the near future, anything like that?
No, as you said, the situation along the Afghan-Tajik border and the Afghan-Turkmen border is, of course, very interesting, with the Taliban making a comeback and even causing some trouble along the border. So we have to keep a close eye on that, as well as the situation in the Caucasus.
Excellent. And, I'd like to thank everybody so much for listening to this podcast. We had a really great response on the first one, and I hope that you guys enjoy this podcast as well. And, of course, if you want to hear this and more, then please visit porkinspolicyreview.wordpress.com. And please do follow both of us on Twitter. You can follow me at Porkins Policy, and you can follow Christoph at New Great Game. And if you have any suggestions, if you have story ideas, if you have topics, anything, articles that you would like us to discuss, then please tweet us at Twitter using the hashtag Porkins Great Game. So I think with there, we're going to leave it. And we will be talking to you in just about a month with a whole new set of stories and topics and talking points and all sorts of things related to the New Great Game itself. So thank you so much. And Christoph, thank you for joining me again.
Thanks, Piers. Thank you.